Welcome to Behind the Wall. I'm Stan Grant. It was a historic moment. The leaders of the Quad Security Dialogue meeting for the first time over the weekend, virtually, of course, considering the threat from COVID. It was an opportunity for Australia, Japan, India and the United States to present a united front, a vision for the future of the Indo-Pacific region, with questions about the threat from China at the top of that list. Well, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd is the president of the Asia Society, and he joins me now from Brisbane. Good to have you on the program. I wanted to start with something that you've written in a recent piece for the Foreign Affairs Journal, and you've said that the 2020s was always going to be a critical period, and that the United States particularly needs to be able to get its line together on how to deal with China. Is that, though, now being accelerated? Do you think that there is a greater sense of urgency right now?
I've described, Stan, the 2020s as the decade of living dangerously between China and the United States, and therefore for the rest of us, as these two 1,000-pound gorillas in the front living room wrestle for, as it were, strategic dominance. The reason I say it for this decade in particular is that it could well be a crossover decade in terms of relative economic power. The Chinese are projecting internally they'll have a bigger economy by 2028. And of course, the Chinese military are projecting privately that by the time they get to decade's end, they'll have a regionally dominant position over the American military, including US Pacific Fleet operations.
What you've outlined there, if it indeed comes to pass that China does in this decade usurp the United States as the biggest economy in the world, it's already the biggest engine of economic growth in the world. If it does establish a military that it believes can fight and win, particularly a regional war, that's a very, very different world. What's your assessment right now of how that is being managed?
So far, and certainly for the last 4 years, it's been an unmitigated disaster. It's the international relations or strategic equivalent of being on the roller coaster ride at Luna Park. It sort of rips and turns and could go off the rails at any moment. Managed strategic competition, the concept that I've advanced, is more along the lines of what are the de minima guardrails we can put around this relationship, which are mutually agreed in Beijing and Washington, which can prevent normal strategic competition from bursting out from beyond the guardrails, as it like, and then generating, mayhem, chaos, conflict, and war. So operationally, what does that mean? Having a very narrowly defined set of what I describe as strategic red lines between the two sides. And that's largely over Taiwan, but also the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Secondly, defining those other areas where it's competition, whether we like it or not, foreign policy, security policy, human rights, as well as trade, investment, technology, and the rest, as these two countries compete. But thirdly, also creating space for strategic cooperation in areas like climate. To do that, however, you need a framework mutually agreed in both capitals. Can they do it? Not sure, but I think there's some interest in Washington and in Beijing in perhaps moving in this sort of direction.
Kevin, you've described it as a dangerous period. You've used the word war now on a couple of occasions, and you've outlined where those red lines are. Is it fair to say that right now, although the risk of conflict, all-out conflict, may still be low, that we are in a phase of preparing for that conflict, given Australia's updated military strategic outlook, given the Quad meeting and increased military cooperation between those countries? Are we now in a period where we are actively preparing for just that worst-case scenario?
Let's speak about the two principal players here, China and the United States. Then I'll reflect on Australia, if you like. Certainly in the case of China, they are preparing, in my judgment, for active military confrontation on the question of returning Taiwan to Chinese sovereignty at some stage between now and 2035. Xi Jinping's statements have indicated that China's military modernization program is destined to be completed by 2027. Xi Jinping will be seeking to be reappointed as leader for life at the 20th Party of Congress at the end of 2022, which means he could well be in office through until the 2030s. For those sorts of reasons, this Taiwan contingency, in my judgment, has moved from, as it were, academic discourse to real military planning. Now, the Americans, fully sensitized to this, are also looking at countermeasures, as are the Taiwanese themselves. And so the big calculus, by the time we get toward the end of this decade, the Chinese believe that they will have achieved a higher level of, shall we say, military superiority in the Taiwan Straits against the United States and the Taiwanese, will be this. Will there be sufficient doubt in the minds of the Chinese military and political leadership at that time as to the inevitability of victory in such a conflict that would cause them to have second thoughts and not embark upon it? That's the essential question.
Given how Xi Jinping may see this moment vis-a-vis China's relationship with the United States and the relative power, does that suggest to you that he may go the other way, that he may be prepared to chance his arm, to call out the United States, to test the US resolve in the region?
Well, Xi Jinping, unlike his predecessors, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, and certainly Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, Xi Jinping's different. And what I've observed in Xi Jinping is someone prepared to break the mold, the previous strategic caution. As you know, Stan, as a keen observer of these events from your time in Beijing, Deng's axiom of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, has been overtaken by a Xi Jinping doctrine, which, if I was to describe it, is loud and proud. And so risk-taking has been part of that, not crazy brave risk-taking, but some level of risk-taking. So I believe we do have these two new variables, rising Chinese power, and leadership now which is prepared to take a strategic risk when absolutely necessary in its judgment, plus what I do fear is perhaps a Chinese underestimation of American strategic resolve and domestic repair. The Chinese, I think, are in grave danger of underestimating America's capacity to rebuild and reinvent itself, as it's done in multiple times in modern history since the end of the Civil War, really, in the 1860s to the present, and therefore to simply assume that the Americans would never fight over Taiwan because it wouldn't work in domestic politics. It would be too big a risk for the American military losing.
Can I just get your thoughts finally on Australia and Australia's position in this? It was an axiom long held that Australia didn't have to choose between its trade relationship with China and its strategic alliance with the United States. Has that choice in fact been made now, particularly given the quadrilateral arrangement, some of the language coming out of Australia in recent times, China's approach to Australia in seeking to punish Australia for comments that the Australian government have made? Has that choice been made?
Well, the binary nature of the relationship between Washington and Beijing, it's true, Stan, has become sharper and sharper. It became more acute, frankly, during the Trump administration, trade war, and a range of other measures as well. And so, therefore, the space in which, as it were, third countries like Australia can navigate a way through both these critical relationships in Washington and Beijing is trickier. It's harder. It's a narrower space. But you know something? When I look at Tokyo and Japan, the Japanese have a bucket load of problems with China. Historically, the war, they have contested territorial claims in the East China Sea, and China is still Japan's largest economic partner, yet still we do not see the Chinese adopting the sort of trade sanctions against Tokyo that China is now adopting towards Australia. So my argument is this. To renormalize the relationship between Beijing and Canberra will be difficult. The Americans, as I've long argued, under Biden will need to say to the Chinese any strategic renormalization with Washington must accommodate a strategic renormalization with Canberra as well. And thank God, both Blinken and Sullivan, I think, are sending that message now to the Chinese. But the Australian government needs to learn to manage its mouth better. It needs to speak less and do more as far as the Australia-China relationship is concerned, rather than play to its own domestic peanut gallery, thinking that every piece of anti-Chinese rhetoric simply adds up votes for you in a Liberal Party pre-selection.
Mr. Rudd, appreciate your thoughts. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Good to be with you, Stan.